In the ancient history of the Middle East, a man named Abraham received a promise from God that he would become the father of many nations. The Bnei Yisrael are the Jewish descendants of Abraham's son Isaac from his wife Sarah. The Bnei Ishmael are the Arabic descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael from his wife's handmaiden Hagar. From the house of Israel, the Jewish prophet Moses would be born, and the Torah would be written. Centuries later, from the house of Israel, Jesus, the Messiah of the Christian faith, would be born, and the New Testament would be written. From the house of Ishmael, the Islamic prophet Muhammad would be born, and the Quran would be written. Through the centuries, the three religions of the Abrahamic faith have collided. In no place more so than Jerusalem. With the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, ancient nations were restored in the Middle East, including the state of Israel, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. And every U.S. president since has tried, with greater or lesser success, to build the alliances needed for a lasting peace. Recently, at an unlikely time, with an unlikely group, led by an unlikely president, nations of the divided faiths of Abraham came together against all odds and laid a foundation for peace that bears the name of their common father, the Abraham Accords. One of the phrases that I learned on this job, in English it would translate to ink on paper. You know, that's just ink on paper. You know, it's a piece of paper. What does it mean? So many times in government, you know, the politicians, they just want to make the announcement. They want to sign something, and then, you know, they're off to the next thing. What we're seeing here is just the opposite.
What's happened now with the Abraham Accords is it's unleashed a torrent of connectivity between Israel and its neighbors, which is going to create a virtuous cycle of the reconnection between Jews, Muslims, Christians in the region. It's creating a lot of economic opportunities between countries. It's going to rise the GDP of the entire region as, you know, hopefully conflict becomes less and economic co-investment and opportunity becomes more. The breakthrough on this is bigger than between just the countries. It's about ending the Arab-Israeli conflict.
The first four agreements within the Abraham Accords were unlike anything that these countries, including the United States, had ever done before. Even with a mutual reservoir of hope and goodwill, the practical aspects of moving beyond ink on paper, especially in the last few months of 2020, were not without its challenges. The Trump administration would be leaving office in January of 2021, which set a deadline for things we hope to accomplish and beginnings we hope to foster.
I was sitting in the trilateral meeting with the national security advisors, with Mayor Ben Shabbat from Israel and Sheikh Taknoum bin Zayed from the UAE, both, you know, phenomenal friends and brilliant people who the countries are very fortunate to have doing the jobs that they do for them. And what I recognized was just how little connectivity there was, meaning that it was almost like a first date, and that both sides didn't know each other at the working level. They didn't know how to work through each other's systems.
Everyone approached this very differently, and we never really, I think, understood that until we had to explain that's what they said, but this is what they meant. The Bahrainis came in an extremely organized way. In the Emirates case, when a decision is made by the Crown Prince, the issue is immediately directed downward.
That decision is made.
That decision is made, and there's no question, and the government moves out accordingly. The Bahrainis and the Emiratis and the Moroccans, to a certain extent, would all look at their Israeli counterparts and say, this is the decision that was made, and this is how we're going to do this. And the Israelis would come back and say, that sounds wonderful. We're in no way, we're not in a position to be able to do that. Our system doesn't accommodate that. We can't issue an order and expect everyone to follow it. It's certainly not in the government. In Israel, everyone's the prime minister. And so the Bahrainis and the Emiratis and Moroccans still have a difficult time understanding it, but they're starting to.
I give the leadership in the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed in particular, a lot of credit for the way that they've doubled and tripled down to figure out how to make this a warm peace and to make it hospitable and open, because this could go slow, it could go medium, it could go fast. They're trying to make it go fast.
When we were riding the first plane over to UAE from Israel, you had the American side and the Israeli side. We had like a little caucus in the front of the plane. The most senior guys on the Israeli side was, listen, because Israelis can get excited, they're commercially aggressive. And we said, just, tone it down, okay? Like, let's not overwhelm. It's our first kind of official meeting. And they're like, no, we got it, we'll tone it down. So we get there. They didn't have to worry at all about being aggressive because the Emiratis really wanted to move forward quickly. And so they matched each other. And I remember they were discussing, and they were like, look, we need to establish a banking relationship. And they're like, let's do it tomorrow. And Jared's like, let's get some, and like the next day they set it up, so they didn't have to hold back. And it was just really fun to watch them together in this way and just so aligned. It felt like brothers that were separated at birth.
Establishing basic diplomacy and communication was, of course, only the beginning of what these nations and their people hope to accomplish by taking this historic step.
What I really do is sit and talk to a lot of scientists and researchers on a daily basis. We work on integrating different technologies together because one technology alone would never work, and that applies humans as well.
Sure.
One person cannot fix a problem. We need to come and work together. So here I'm talking about environmental issues, we're talking about renewable energy, climate immigration, climate and food security. They're also interconnected, these two issues. All of these issues that we're going to face in the future require nations and countries to work together. We will not be able to resolve them one nation at a time. It needs the world to think globally to face them. So something like the pandemic just showed us it's going to affect all of us. To see the Abraham Accords building these connections, I really care dearly about this because it's going to affect the future. I'm trying to build technology that's going to solve, but people still fighting here over small things. To have people to come together and make a decision and literally say, all these reasons you had before, leave them aside, come together because that's the only way we need to live. I believed in it, but to see it in my time, I did not expect it.
Really, areas of cooperation span from space to the National Archives, and everything in between.
We signed an agreement on cooperation in science, technology, innovation, but also space. UAE is very advanced in space. We were a few director generals, but I was the only woman. And I was very fortunate that my counterpart was also a woman. Her Excellency El Amiri. This area, which is top area for Israel and a top priority for the UAE, is led by women, which should be very natural, but it's not always. So space is the future, and science technology is the common ground for a lot of potential cooperation. Israel, the US, and UAE have both invested a lot in these areas. It's a potential for not only a bilateral partnership, but also a trilateral partnership. We want to have joint research, joint projects, joint conferences, share ideas between, researchers.
We went through and we made a list where we'll try to connect the universities, we'll try to connect the healthcare industries because COVID was still obviously rampant and unfortunately is still a problem. Substantive ways that we can show the world that people are interacting. We have been almost embarrassed by how many creative people have come forward and thought of things that I would never have thought of as ways to connect their economies. I saw a music video of somebody singing about going to Dubai, an Israeli performer. I've seen fruit stands in the Dubai market with Israeli flags made out of flowers and fruits, and each day I am learning of a new way that the economies and the people are coming together that I could not have predicted, and that's the fact that I think is most important here.
You know that more than 1,000 Israeli and Emiratis and Bahrainis companies, private companies, are in different level of engagement. 1,000, wow. Listen to the number, less than 9 months.
Young Arabs are tired of conflict. Young people in the Emirates, if you're 25 years old, you did not live through the 1973 war, the 1967 war. You didn't witness the Intifada, so that's not something that's in your psyche.
Right.
You are seeing Israel as an opportunity. The business community see a market that they haven't been able to tap into that now they can tap into.
Sure.
Deal flow will increase, trade will increase. We're negotiating a free trade agreement with Israel as we speak. And I think the benefits of the Abraham Accords that are touched or felt by people are going to increase.
Governments initiate things, but the people make it a real peace. Connections are building in the country, not in the government, in the economy, in the high tech, between people, and these connections will make it last.
This is going to be the new world that we're part of.
Think about one day, my children, I'll sit with them and I'll explain to them, there was a time when if you were in Israel, you couldn't take a flight between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. You couldn't go on a plane between Israel and Bahrain, or even Israel and Morocco. And I think they're gonna look at us and they're gonna say to us, what do you mean? Of course you could.
It's happening already. It's happening already.
And within 6 months, you have hundreds of thousands of people going back and forth. The economies are going to become so intertwined and the positive reactions are going to just continue to grow that there will come a time where people won't even know that there was such a thing as these countries not getting along.
We were on an Al flight, and then we took off, and then we started looking in the screen, and we were in Jordan, which is fine because we have peace in Jordan, but then we crossed the border to Jordan, and we were on Saudi Arabia, which we all took pictures. We couldn't believe, we have these small screens on the plane, and you will start taking pictures because we're going, and we are flying over Saudi Arabia. I don't know if you can understand as an Israel because, Americans can fly everywhere. Well, we cannot. There's so few countries we can go in the Middle East.
We have a say that Sheikh Zayed says, "Al-ard ard Allah, واللي بي حياها الله." The land is God's land, and whoever is coming to us, they're welcome on this land.
I never felt more welcome than when I landed in UAE.
And now, to some people, it seems so natural to take a plane, 3 hours, fly over Saudi, land here, go to the pool, visiting the Great Mosque, as if it's something that people do. It's something that people do here in the last 8 months.
For us to come here and to see this beautiful kosher catering facility.
It's a joint venture with Emirates Airline, producing premium kosher in Dubai for export.
It's kosher, right? So Jews can eat it. And it's halal, right? So Muslims can eat it.
Food is about commonality. And when we can eat each other's food, we can come together. All the conditions for Jewish flourishing are now here in the UAE.
I have Israelis asking us, and this is amazing, how come we don't yet have licenses to work here? So, you know, it's already past tense for them. Israelis are moving here to live in an Arab country.
I don't know if people realize how many Israeli Jews came from Arab countries, from Morocco to Libya to Tunis to Egypt and Syria and Lebanon. I mean, it's half the country of Israel. They come from Arab countries. For 2 or 3 generations, they've been away, but it's sort of like muscle memory.
The 1.5 million Moroccan Jews living in Israel, the country is hoping that they will come back. I'm a Chabad rabbi here in Casablanca, Morocco. My family history is 2,000 years of being in Morocco. My father's side has been here since the Spanish Inquisition, so that goes back to 500 years. But my mother's side is from the time of the First Temple.
From the destruction of the first temple.
Yeah.
Going to the US, a lot of people found it very difficult to understand how I could be Arab and Jewish at the same time. Jews came from the Middle East. Moses was in Egypt. Abraham was in Mecca. Our roots are here, are based here within the Arab world. This Jewish community started coming in the 1880s. They were coming from Iraq, and they were looking for better prospects outside Iraq, and they were on their way to India. Most of them, the ship stopped in Bahrain. They liked what they saw, and they ended up staying in Bahrain. Hopefully, we're looking forward to creating more Jewish life in Bahrain.
Somebody told me, we've lost a lot of time, and let's catch up the time. He was speaking about the Jews and the Muslim communities.
Sharaka was formed immediately in the wake of the Abraham Accords by young leaders from Israel and the Gulf to act as a bridge between us on a people-to-people level and put that vision of peace to reality. You know, the first thing that Sharaka did was bring a delegation of young leaders from Bahrain and UAE to Israel.
When His Highness actually announced the Abrahamic Accords on Twitter, I was like, I have to be part of it.
They're analysts, journalists, novelists, and artists, social entrepreneurs, all under the age of 40, and in Israel to make connections.
In 1,000,000 years, did you ever think that you would be lighting a Hanukkah candle at the Western Wall in Jerusalem?
I did not see that coming.
They lit the Hanukkah candles at the Kotel on Hanukkah. It's something I've been trying to do. You would assume that I would get a chance to do that.
You should have called me. We would have invited you.
I had the tremendous honor to receive a group of influencers from Bahrain and UAE and Egypt. They came to Israel and toured. They had just come from Yad Vashem to Knesset, and it was Hanukkah, our festival of lights, where we not only increase the light every single night, but we understand that with that we increase influence. One light does not take away from the light next to it.
one of the most moving visits for them was to Yad Vashem. Grown men and women moved to tears. They have a certain perception of Israel, of Jews, of history. So for them to be here and see it for themselves, see the evidence, they felt moved by what they saw, not just to tears, but to action. The Arab and Gulf members of Shiraka, for example, initiated the first Arab Gulf-led commemoration of the Holocaust.
For the first time, Holocaust remembrance ceremonies were carried out in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain.
I was almost in tears just to see the entire thing with our cousins, with our new friends here in Dubai.
And out of that, they put together a blueprint for promoting Holocaust education and awareness and combating anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And when you look at also, I think, the educational system, certainly in the UAE, they're already teaching about the Abraham Accords, already teaching about why they're so important. And they've already for many years now been talking about Israel and about the Jewish people's place, not just in the world, but in the Middle East. Peace doesn't happen overnight.
My grandmother grew up in Tangier, and she remembers as a child that they were starting to ask Jews to come and give their names, and they were starting to make the lists.
In World War II, the Germans also conquered all of North Africa. And when the Germans showed up in Morocco and said, "Give me your Jews," it was this king's grandfather who was the king at that point in time.
He turned to them and said, we don't have Jews, we only have Moroccan subjects. But what's even more amazing is that I think that he somewhat risked his life because he wasn't running the country sort of at that time. Right. The country was being ran by the French.
Morocco's king is commander of the faithful. He's not commander of the Muslims. What's important is that we included the memory of Jewish history and Jewish identity, Moroccan identity, into the textbooks for school children. And we also teach Holocaust memory, and that's part of Morocco's history. It's not something coming from the outside. It's Morocco's history. The story of King Mohammed V, how he resisted French colonial anti-Semitic policies. It's the story of how our fathers and grandfathers participated in the liberation of Europe as a continent. So this is a part of history that must be taught to our children, and that's what we do in Morocco.
In order to combat something, you have to first define it. And never again comes from the place that understands not only anti-Semitism, all forms of hate, but certainly anti-Semitism is what enabled the genocide of the Jews in World War II. Never again is a prospective statement, it's future-looking. When we understand that teaching coexistence that we see in textbooks actually in UAE and Bahrain. The UAE and Morocco have adopted the IHRA definition for anti-Semitism.
Right.
If that's not recognition, I don't know what is. I hosted this group of influencers, and one of them actually screamed out, "We don't just recognize you, we love you."
This is so amazing. We're so happy to be here. We love you.
Dubai's Crossroads of Civilizations Museum has just opened the first permanent Holocaust exhibit in the Arab world.
called the Crossroads of Civilization Museum, trying to highlight the positive history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We focus on the kinship more than anything else. So capitalizing on our religious values, same source, capitalizing on our history. When the Jews and the Arabs were working together, were living together in peace in the past, the Middle East was a great place, was adding to the humanity in terms of science, knowledge, other areas. And it's very important to revive them. One of the things happened after the peace accord, we had the first dialogue between Israelis and the Emiratis, between the Jewish people and the Muslim. Was here in this museum, sponsored by our government here.
That mural that you see as you walk in, that was painted by a young Emirati artist and a young Israeli artist. It just says it all, right? It says it all.
Exactly.
You have in your museum a very famous statement in the Jewish tradition. What I didn't know until today is that it also comes from the Quran.
You know, if you save one life, you save the whole world. You kill one life, it's like you killed the whole world.
You now have a permanent exhibition on the Holocaust, which you instituted after the Abraham Accords.
It is the biggest tragedy in all humanity, in the whole world, that happened against the Jews and also against all humanity, this crime. You know, we need to study it so it will never happen again, and we make sure people, you know, to acknowledge this reality and not be in denial. We need to work on how can we treat anti-Semitism. It's like terrorism. You cannot just work with the symptoms. From the security and military level, we have to also treat it from the roots, social, ideological, you know, and education aspect.
Jews are going to move to the UAE coming from Europe, escaping anti-Semitism. If somebody would have told you that, you know, a year, 2 years ago, I mean, it's pretty amazing.
It boggles the mind.
Just yesterday, as my plane was landing, there were 2 planes that were landing in Marrakesh, the first 2 direct flights that came from Israel here. And I know that the flights from here going to Israel and Royal Air Morocco are going to begin shortly.
Having this direct connection was really one of our priority, and we've been working hard to make it happen quickly. It's about easing the mobility of people who are willing to visit both sides. There are a lot of people excited to learn more about each other and to work together, because this is a relationship that is built with conviction. We'll show it on the field, public and private sector, and normal people too.
I'm in charge of tourism for Jerusalem. Many Muslims in the Gulf really have on their bucket list to come and pray on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, and we are today laying the infrastructure for the future Muslim tourism, Muslim pilgrims that we've never really seen in great numbers in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem means Yerushalayim, city of peace. It's been anything but a city of peace for almost this entire 3,000-year history. Now it's as good as it's ever been. I mean, in terms of the openness and tolerance for multiple religions.
I think peace is the most difficult path to pursue. And it is difficult to convince those who have already set minds or have vested interests.
The Abraham Accords are technically normalization agreements, but the parties involved also call them peace agreements because of the goals and the spirit behind them. A spirit that would hopefully move the parties to dialogue and cooperation in times of regional conflict. Although it was a lesson that none of us wished to learn this quickly, already in 2021 we found out whether the Accords would hold in the heat of war between Israel and Hamas. We knew that there would be stresses on the Accords because this is a very dynamic region. There's still a lot of volatility, there's still a lot of extremism. And the first test came along last month, right? There's a war between Hamas and Israel.
What started as a flashpoint over threatened evictions of Palestinian families and clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque is escalating towards an all-out war. Sirens ringing out, warning Israelis to take cover. the Iron Dome, intercepting as many incoming projectiles as possible. The punishing retaliation of an air assault on Gaza targets by Israeli forces, pushing the casualty count higher with each cycle.
This was the perfect opportunity for them to say, let's blow up the Accords, the Abraham Accords, while we can, and shake it.
Riots in the streets, Arab violence visited upon Jews, as well as Jewish violence visited upon Arabs inside Israel. Israel said Hamas fired more than 4,000 rockets at Israel in recent days.
I have a 4-year-old and almost 4-month-old. Cradling my baby, my 4-month-old, in a makeshift shelter after rockets were fired at us, fired at Israel, and fired on Tel Aviv at that point by Hamas terrorists, like 3 a.m. in the morning. So many families across Israel, some like 6 million, I think, that's 2/3 of the country, that ended up being not only in the firing range of the rockets, but forced to flee for shelter. And we live in an apartment building, so we didn't have enough time to actually make it to the shelter, which is downstairs. So we had to do with a makeshift protection area, which was the stairway. You know, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you hear the siren, your children are asleep. You know, your first priority, your only thought is, I have to get my family, I have to get my children. No parent, no father, no mother, no one should be forced to do that. Within moments of me running to shelter, the first people to ask me, are you okay, were my friends from the Emirates and from Bahrain. I can't begin to describe how meaningful, how impactful, and how important that was. They reached out before some of my other friends.
I have so many Israeli friends, and at the same time, so many Palestinian friends, and I had to call each and every one of them. Are you guys okay? Are you fine? We are with you, you know, sending you all the prayers, all the support, whatever you need. I'm not being judgmental. I'm not following whatever I see in the media, because they would show you whatever they want you to see. Yeah. You know, not the full picture, you know, just parts of the picture.
Because of the Abraham Accords, they know what is happening here. They're not getting their information now from the mainstream media. They have direct access to us, as we do to them now.
Now we are creating the perception ourselves, we're learning ourselves, we're taking that responsibility.
My heart goes to the people from Israel and Palestine. Yeah. And I'm talking about the people, you know, because people suffer.
I saw Israel and the UAE and the other Abraham Accord partners. To the extent they disagreed, they did so respectfully. To the extent that there were issues, they were handled by friends. And we're now on the other side of that conflict. And I'm seeing the first test of the Abraham Accords, the first real test, we all passed.
With flying colors, with flying colors, Ambassador. I would say what many people don't know is that during those difficult 11 days of fighting, there was constant communication between our Foreign Minister, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, and the Israeli Foreign Minister, Gabi Ashkenazi. And the UAE played an important role in reaching out and in urging a quick ceasefire and in urging support for the Egyptian initiative.
Normally, there would have been this blow-up Security Council meeting with everyone condemning Israel. I can't even believe in what I faced at the UN, that you didn't have this massive blow-up and press conferences and votes and people being angry.
And I always say that the two most countries that have been helpful to the Palestinians have been Egypt and Jordan, and both of them have relations with Israel. The Abrahamic Accords allowed us to also be a helping hand, a helping voice to the Israelis.
Israel has agreed to a mutual unconditional ceasefire to begin in less than 2 hours. I extend my sincere gratitude to President al-Sisi and the senior Egyptian officials who played such a critical role in this diplomacy. I also appreciate the contributions of other parties in the region who have been engaged in working toward the end of hostilities.
I would like to think that in a small way we played a role in that Israeli decision.
I think you played a large role, and I'll tell you why from my perspective. Israel often has felt isolated over its history. It's the only Jewish state in the entire world, surrounded by 20 or so Arab countries. Relations have mostly not been good over the last 70 years since it was founded. When Israel feels isolated, naturally it causes itself to close ranks and to think narrowly about its own issues. With the Abraham Accords, that isolation has modulated, it's lifted a certain amount. And as it's lifted, it's kind of opened up, I think, Israeli society to think more about the bigger picture and to feel less isolated and less threatened. The less threatened it feels, the more open it is, I think, to finding, less violent means of resolution. And I think it was a major role that you played.
During the conflict in Gaza, I was hosted in the houses of local Emiratis, talking to young people. And one thing kept coming back, and that was, for the first time we have a chance to hear the other side. And another sentence was, where were we in the last 72 years? Music to our ears, really.
We supported Egypt during its diplomatic move and effort, together with the United States, to reach a ceasefire in the Gaza conflict. We hope that this ceasefire will last.
Sure.
And we hope that we can all, as international community, together with our friends, really the Americans, to convert the situation into an opportunity to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli issue once for all.
I think it's important to understand what the Abrahamic Accords are about. They are about building bridges. They are about the future. We don't see it here as a substitute for direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, because I think only the Israelis and Palestinians can actually decide and determine how these will go. And I think we need to urge both parties to negotiate, because the region cannot really afford the sort of intermittent confrontations as we see. This will be another bridge, yet another bridge really, in trying to build something more stable, and I would say also something more lasting for the region.
Do you agree that the Abraham Accords can be scaled eventually to hopefully bring better relations between Israel and the Palestinians?
Absolutely. I think the Abraham Accord is a paradigm shift. It's a choice that Muslim Arab countries made. I hope that they will change the old politics where they taking us to international tribunals and ICC and other places. That's not the way to build confidence and trust. I can tell you that our new friends from the Gulf and others try to exercise their leverage with the Palestinians to explain them that.
The UAE just joined the Security Council, so we have more things to watch.
Friends.
We have friends. We have
Israel
friends to watch.
has friends now.
Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, and the United Arab Emirates are elected members of the United Nations Security Council for a 2-year term beginning on 1st of January 2022.
Our peace plan began with the belief that an undivided Jerusalem and a more secure Israel would be stabilizing and of benefit to the entire Middle East. Especially after the accords were signed, what we saw and experienced was that regional stability also derived from a sense of community. Diplomatic recognition is a formal acknowledgement by one country that another should be engaged as a member of the international community. In international politics, without mutual recognition, there is no community. For 70 years, Israel was not recognized by most of its closest neighbors and had not been included in the larger community of the Middle East. Even by the United States military, which considered Israel to be within EUCOM, the military's European command, rather than CENTCOM, the division responsible for the Middle East. That changed within the first year of the Abraham Accords. This is perhaps the greatest hope demonstrated by the Accords, that in very tangible ways, for the first time in far too many years, Israel's neighbors have welcomed it into the regional community.
And so if you look at the Arab League now, 6 out of the 21 current members recognize Israel. Let's get to 7.
It's amazing.
Let's get to 8. It's almost a third. It is the first positive momentum that we have had in a generation for peace between Israel and its neighbors. And it could lead to the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict if stewarded in the proper fashion.
You know, I'm pretty old. I fought the Yom Kippur War. Then we grew up on what's called the Israeli-Arab conflict. Now with Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Basically, this Israeli-Arab conflict fade away. For me, as a Sabra who was born here, with this independence war against 7 militaries, with the 6-Day War, with the Yom Kippur War, that's a big thing.
September 15th, 2021 marked the first anniversary of the initial Abraham Accords. In that year, several new embassies had opened, with Israel and Morocco opening liaison offices to be upgraded to embassies in the near future. Bahrain and Israel signed new trade and cooperation deals, and in August, the Israeli government had unveiled the Israeli-Moroccan Chamber of Commerce in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, trade between Israel and the UAE was already nearing $1 billion. In September, Israel and the UAE held their first joint scientific conference. Around the anniversary of the Accords, Israel named its first ambassador to Bahrain, and Bahrain's first ambassador to Israel also presented his credentials to Israeli President Herzog. That same month, Ambassador Nonu's cousin, Ibrahim Nonu, led Shabbat services in a synagogue in the main thoroughfare of Manama, Bahrain, for the first time in 74 years. In the United States, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, and Robert Greenway established the Abraham Accords Peace Institute with a 5-year charter to continue strengthening ties and opportunities between the Accords nations, as well as with nations that might join the Accords at a later date. With offices in Florida and Jerusalem, I established the Friedman Center for Peace Through Strength to advocate for strong ties among the Accords nations within the foundation of an ever-strengthening alliance between the United States and Israel.
You know, it's interesting. You leave government and you're no longer able to effectuate things in the way you once did, yet the way you care about it still remains, right? And so
yeah, sure.
I just try my best to really try to isolate this achievement outside of the partisan world in which things always unfortunately fall in. You know, let's fight about most everything else, but this, let's try to keep it as pure as I think it is. I would help any administration. It doesn't matter to me. As long as you have peace breaking out in the region, there's this momentum. Let's capitalize on it. Let's not let it falter through whatever it may be.
We're trying to create something new. Don't drag along the negativity. Leave it behind. This is a new page. Think positively. People need to come together and really start not only imagining it, but we're living it now, to live this new world.
That's what service is about. If you're going to, go into government, you want to take on as many problems as you have the capacity to take on, and you want to work on, trying to solve the hardest things. And that's the only way you're ever going to get results on the hardest things. In that regard, it was a tremendous, tremendous adventure.
Yeah, look, I'd like to think that there are sort of two camps in the political world. There are people that just want to be in power because they want to be in power, and those are sort of the permanent political class in Washington. And then there are the people that I think our Constitution contemplated, the ones that come into government for a limited period of time, do what they can, and then go back to their lives. I think we fell into that latter category.
The way that I looked at it was that in life, every opportunity has a cost, right? And so for me, the opportunity was to serve my country, to work on some of the hardest problems, and to really have a president who was willing to give us a pretty wide aperture to come up with creative solutions to problems that had not been solved before, and hiring a lot of untraditional people who weren't, qualified by Washington, standards to do these jobs. And so the cost of that obviously was you get beaten up in the press, you have people, who don't like the fact that you're doing things in different ways than they did it.
I think you have a group of people in the Abraham Accords that leaned in. I remember we were on the plane going back from one of the meetings, and I said, Jared, as this was coming together, how were you able to go forward? Because everybody told you it was impossible, everyone. And he said, I don't know, I thought about it, and the approach made sense.
And I never thought that the office I was in was my office. I felt like this is an office that I'm the current inhabitant of, and then, at some point the whistle's gonna blow and I'm gonna clean out my stuff and I'm gonna hand it to the next guy. I'll leave a nice note and I'll say, good luck, I'm rooting for you, I hope you do an amazing job.
I sometimes joke that rocket scientists were the biggest victor in this whole peace deal, because now people still think that that's really hard, but Middle East peace, we could do it.
Right,
so
right,
anyway.
Right.
We are living in a world that knows a lot of headwinds, difficult times. We live our Islam with serenity, peacefully, with tolerance, and we want to share this message. We have so much to learn from each other and hopefully give an example for other countries in the region to join this dynamic.
When we think of the legacy of Abraham, we can think of religion, or we can think about his real legacy. When I personally think of the Abrahamic Accords, I think of Abraham's message continuing all through the years of one God bringing light to the world.
Monotheism began with Abraham. Man's relationship with God began with Abraham. God's covenant was given to Abraham and his progeny. And Abraham's initial progeny were Jews and Arabs, perhaps the oldest peoples on earth. Here we are, about 4,000 years later, after millennia of conflict, of suffering, and of inhumanity. And what do we see? That the Jews are still here. The Arabs are still here. And in keeping with the tradition of Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael, they remain desirous of peace and reconciliation. With the Abraham Accords, we have begun that process. It is now up to people of goodwill throughout the world to build upon this breakthrough and to end, once and for all, the heartbreaking conflicts of the Middle East. To all who pursue peace, may God guide their path.
Hey, I'm Mati Shoshani, and thank you for watching the TBN Israel YouTube channel. We hope this video gave you greater understanding of Israel and her people. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to share what you've learned and ask your questions in comments below. And invite your friends to join the conversation.